All right, everyone. My apologies for not being there today. My neck is quite stiff, and I can barely look over to my right or my left either. Um, but hopefully, I'll be better. Hopefully, later tonight. Hopefully, by tomorrow, and definitely, hopefully, by Wednesday. So, without further ado, just a few announcements. We'll be posting the presentation schedules later this week, and I'll go over those in class on Wednesday. This week, today we talked about prejudice, discrimination, moving into violence and aggression on Wednesday, and we'll be talking about that topic going into next week as well. And going to spend a little bit of time talking about conflict resolution. Going to be looking at some series of psychology experiments, social psychology experiments done with Israeli and Palestinian participants. And I think those will be very illuminating and I think maybe shed some light on some things going on today. So stay tuned for that for next week. To begin then today, we start with Henri Teifel. Teifel was a very interesting person. He had a very interesting life. He served in the French army, left Poland basically, joined the army to fight the Nazi invaders. He was captured, and he would have probably been sent to an extermination camp if they would have known that he was Jewish, but he pretended not to be, and that probably saved his life. But he, like many people, came out of the experiments wanting to know what the hell just happened, and kind of spearheaded a lot of the early work on intergroup dynamics. One of his first experiments was to bring in two groups, and these were about 60 British school kids, boys, age 14 and 15, and he showed them paintings, some by Paul Klee and the others by Wassily Kandinsky, and the boys were told that they'd be grouped based on which painter they preferred, although the actual group assignment was completely random. They didn't have any interaction with themselves, with each other. The people who like Klee didn't have any interaction with other people in the so-called Klee group. And there was no competition either. So just two groups. And the next part of the experiment was giving each of the participants a small amount of money that they were to give to some anonymous others. They didn't have to be members of, the same group or the same, the other kids who also, like Klee or Kandinsky, or who they thought they did, and so on. But what they found was that the boys would give more money to members of their own group than the other. And again, there's no competition, there's, no interaction between them, but nonetheless, it was found that the boys would still, want to maximize the difference between the two groups rather than, increase the total group gain, which is pretty interesting. And this is an example of what we call the minimal group paradigm, where essentially the groups are, the people in the groups are relatively similar, but the groups are created arbitrarily. And, trying to see if even if you make the groups so that they're, pretty much the same except for one sort of thing, such as liking Klee or Kandinsky, or how are people going to respond when they are put in these sort of minimal groups? And so this is kind of this approach that is used in the study of group behavior and intergroup behavior, especially. Another major figure in the development of the study of groups and prejudice and so on. Muzaffar Sharif, he had a very interesting life, as you can see the list of things that he lived through. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of Turkey and one autocratic regime in Turkey. Saw the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism and fascism, the Second World War, McCarthyism, you know, also the Russian Revolution, and all of that as well. He has a lot of work in political psychology that until at least a couple of years ago, there was still a lot of it that hadn't been translated from Turkish. And I don't know if it has been translated yet. I kind of feel like it has, but if it has not, well, maybe, you have something you can work on. So his most famous experiment was he was done with a couple of other researchers, including his wife, Carolyn Sharif, and it was called the Robbers Cave Experiment. And what they did was, in the mid-50s, they spent a few hundred hours screening these boys to take part in this experiment. They wanted to make sure that they were basically the same across, in many ways. So they, made sure that they were all from intact middle class families. They were pretty much the same age. There was no ethnic differences, pretty much the same. They were all white kids. And then they brought them to this place called Robbers Cave. Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, where the bank robber Jesse James used to hide out, hence the name. And the boys were brought in separate buses, and they were not aware of each other's existence. So they brought them. They each had like a cabin on other sides of the state park, and during the first phase of the experiment, they had the groups sort of engaged in group building activities. So they'd be working on something together, playing games amongst them within the groups and so on. And some interesting things kind of started to happen. So each group just kind of independently, decided they needed a name. So one group named themselves the Eagles, the other group named themselves the Rattlers, and there was a hierarchy that emerged, and sort of the group members, the kids who are the most popular, were made the leaders, and it was all going great and everything. And then the second phase of the experiment begins, where there are these tournaments between groups. So they're playing baseball against each other, football, other things like that. And if the one group won, they would get a prize. If they didn't win, they wouldn't get anything. And right away, hostility begins between the groups. Kind of fights breaking out, name calling, this kind of thing. And it even got so bad that they were like steal each other's flags, sneak over to the other where the other group was and steal their flag. Excuse me. And interestingly, the dynamics of the group also changed. The leaders the boys who had been chosen as leaders during, we might call the peacetime, before they came into contact with the other group, they actually kind of fell from power, so to speak, and more athletically or more aggressive boys were elevated to the leadership role, which is kind of interesting. There's been studies looking at who people would prefer as a leader during times of peace or during times of war, and so they showed pictures of different people, they were all men actually, showed different pictures of men and women, asking if they prefer them to be leaders or not. During peacetime, people chose the the men who had a, quote, more feminine face. During war times, a more, quote, masculine face. And what is a feminine face and a masculine face? Well, come to class on Wednesday and we'll go over that as well, because it plays a big role in how we perceive aggression. Not necessarily accurately perceive aggression, but it's sort of the way our brains kind of operate. So, you have this hostility between the groups, and the third phase of the experiment then is, okay, how can we have some conflict resolution? And so what they did then was to bring them together in non-competitive situations to see if there would be hostility that emerged. And in these sort of non-competitive situations, you wouldn't see those hostilities. And they then wanted to see, well, can we get them to work together? And it appeared that the best way to do that was to have them work on what they called a superordinate goal, some goal that goes beyond just the interests of one group. And so a couple of examples were the water supply was disrupted, and so the boys had to work together to fix the pipe. Another example, a truck had broken down, so the boys had to get together and pull it together, push it out, push it, and so on. And by the end of it, they're all hanging out, and they take the same bus home, and you have boys from the different groups sitting amongst each other, with each other. Friendships are made, lifelong friendships. I don't know if it was lifelong, but anyway, friendships. The group sort of hostilities and competition, came to an end, and you had sort of world peace there. Okay, so how exactly do we think about ourselves as groups and outgroups and so on? We start with our own personal identities, and oftentimes how we think about ourselves, is shaped by a large extent by the social identity that we see ourselves as part of. And there's obviously a sort of back and forth relationship between our personal identity and social identity. And this comes about through social categorization, essentially thinking of in terms of in-groups, out-groups. And we do this automatically, as much as, people would like to say, oh, I see everyone in the world as equals, and, I don't judge or prejudice or, group people, and that's not true. People may think that they think that way, but if you put them under various experiments, all the data suggests that we do actually in our minds, either consciously or unconsciously, group in terms of us, them, and they can be everything from people on the same floor, living on the same floor as us, to our ethnic groups, our nationalities, religions, etc., etc., etc. And obviously, we compare ourselves, our group, in group, to the out group, and it will then, it will play a role in our social identity as well. So social identity theory is an important aspect, and as you can see, there's some of it develops as a need for self-esteem. Now, obviously, we've talked about self-esteem, and it varies, culturally, but nonetheless, we do see that there is, self-esteem, or viewing our self-worth, and so on and so forth. And so the things that can lead to, that affect our self-esteem, our personal identity, our personal achievements, obviously play a role in self-esteem, but also social identity. So our group achievements, it turns out, our self-esteem is affected by how well our group that we identify with is doing. And sort of sad finding here is that actually our self-esteem can go up by negatively evaluating outgroups. So essentially, people's self-esteem can go up if they denigrate members of an outgroup. The kind of classic experiment in this area was done when there were participants that were brought in randomly, and they were given in like an IQ test or something. And some of them were told then they weren't given their true results. Some of them were told that they did very well. Some of them were told that they did poorly. You're just sorry, you did really bad on this intelligence test, you're a total dumbass, and so on and so forth. And then the, experiment actually begins, which is they had to watch this video, excuse me, where it was made clear to the participants, or half of them, that there was a job interview that they're watching, and it was clear that the candidate was Jewish. They had like a yarmulke or something. And the other half of the participants didn't know that the job candidate was Jewish. And so later on, they had to rate how well they thought they did in their job interview. And as you can see, the participants whose self-esteem had been threatened rated the candidate more negatively if they thought she was Jewish. They made sure, obviously, that none of the participants doing the ratings were Jewish. The participants whose were told that they did well on the intelligence test, so their self-esteem was not threatened. They didn't rate the Jewish candidates nearly as negatively. So they had them then take in these self-esteem surveys, kind of like the different surveys we've been taking in class, and they found that after they had rated the job interview, they took the self-esteem test and found that they actually, people who then rated the Jewish candidate as more negatively, they scored higher on the self-esteem test. Their self-esteem test scale went up. Their score on it went up, as opposed to how they were doing before. So yeah, it turns out that denigrating members of the outgroup actually can bolster one's self-esteem. Not exactly an encouraging finding in terms of in-group out-group dynamics, but this is sort of the reality and kind of the challenges I think you need to be aware of when it comes to thinking about these things. So another much more recent experiment, they showed a bunch of images to participants like this, and as you can see, they're blue. So I'm not sure, if the person is black or white or brown or pink or whatever, and so they had to, kind of think about, okay, are they taller? Do they weigh more? And so on and so forth. Essentially, some of them were given names, and some of the names were stereotypically white or stereotypically black. And as we'll see, that plays a huge, huge role in some very important experiments. And what they found was that if the participants thought they were taller or weighed more if they were black than if they thought they were white. So if they had a black sounding name, a more stereotypically black name like Jamal or something, they were, the participants thought they weighed more and taller than the participants who saw the same image but with a name like Greg or something, it was kind of a white name or whatever. So again, that plays a pretty big role. So this, gets to the simulation that you took part in a couple weeks ago, or that you did, that kind of tries to measure our implicit attitudes. So there are explicit racial attitudes where people are just, very open about their, prejudices. But for the most part, most people aren't very open. And a lot of people either don't think that they're prejudiced, or they don't want to talk about it. And here you can see some more sort of implicit attitudes, the sort of more automatic assessments that get made. So you've taken the implicit association test. I'm not going to explain it in great detail. There's a lot of information in the book, and you can read under this slide. And you can take it again if you want to. It's sort of a very interesting test. So as I said, basically you're, it's basically testing how quickly you tap a key based on the face that you see and the words that are associated with it, good, bad, and these things sort of come together. With the basic idea being that for people who are maybe prejudiced, I'll give the example that I did, which is I did one on elderly. People who are prejudiced against the elderly would press a key when the same key is used for old faces and negative words. Participants would then repeat the procedure, pairing the two groups with the positive and negative words switched. And essentially, there should be a difference in the time. What's been found is that both young and older individuals basically show a prejudice in favor of the young over the old. 2/3 of white respondents showed a strong or moderate prejudice for white over black. About 50% of black respondents also showed the same prejudice in favor of white faces. And what's been shown too is that they've started to see if there's a correlation between the scores on the implicit association test and person's neural activity. And what they found was that a person's IAT responses were very correlated with heightened neural activity in the amygdala, the fear and loathing, the fear and emotional learning part of the brain that we've talked about before. When they would see a face that made them more uncomfortable, or that they maybe had a greater bias toward. So they measured that, but they also had them take the modern racism scale, basically a survey, and for the most part these aren't the best measures of racism, because most people will fill out a survey that shows them being significantly less prejudiced than they might be. And so the scores on the modern racism scale were not correlated with the difference in neural activity. This seemed to be something that you only saw in with the implicit association test. So my results showed that I have a slight automatic preference for young people over old people. Well, maybe that's because I'm still young. We'll see. I want to take this, test maybe every year and maybe see if it changes over time, if I start to become more prejudiced against the young over time, and so on. So anyway, I think, the implicit association test, very interesting. So, yes, this is what I just said. You saw more heightened activity in the amygdala. Excuse me. You also saw more activation in certain parts of the brain, such as the fusiform face area and the frontal cortex. And, there would be unfamiliar faces that they were shown. Some of them would be labeled as in-group rather than out-group members, and there'd be more of this activation happening depending on which group they were kind of lumped into. Well, that's all been very interesting, and people have kind of there's been a lot of critiques of the research as well. Does it measure prejudice, or is it just a reaction to novelty? It's starting to look like, it seemed like it was more novelty a couple of years ago, and my understanding is that more research has been done. It is seeming to be more, have to do with more with prejudice than just simply novelty, a face that you're not as familiar with, and maybe a different ethnic group or something like that. So, some creative researchers thought, well, how would monkeys do taking the implicit association test? And so they had rhesus monkeys, and obviously they couldn't do the same test, but they were shown photos of in group and out group monkeys. And so they measured how much time they spent looking at the face, and they then had a task, the monkey-friendly IAT task, where they had images of the in-group, out-group monkeys, and they were paired with the positive, and they can't read obviously, so they paired them with images of the positive stimuli, which was fruit, or the negative stimuli, which was pears. I mean, not pears, spiders. Don't know why said pears, maybe because I saw a pear somewhere in there. Okay, anyway. And then how long they looked was seen as an indicator of these implicit associations. Well, what were the results? So the monkeys looked longer at out-group faces than in-group faces, sort of showing that kind of heightened vigilance. In the pairing task, when they had to look at the in-group and out-group monkeys, that they'd be lumped together with the fruit pictures or the spider pictures. If the in group was lumped with the fruit, they would they wouldn't look as long because it just seemed like, oh yeah, obviously, that seems right. But they would look longer if they saw members of their in group and paired with a picture of spiders, or vice versa. And this was sort of a measure of the monkey implicit bias. There's a gender dimension to it as well. The male macaques, monkeys, I think they had them do it with them as well, showed a stronger implicit bias than the females, which is kind of interesting. And we'll talk about some of this stuff more when we talk about gender. So, as I said earlier, names play a role. And some of the most interesting and really kind of explanatory measures of sort of prejudice in the real world started in the early 2000s. And I was actually in college, and I remember when some of these first studies started coming out and learning about them. And now we have like 26 years of these fantastic studies. So these studies are pretty simple. What they did was they got together a bunch of resumes, stellar resumes that were exactly the same. And they were exactly the same except for one crucial detail. The name was different. Some of the names were in the initial experiment. They started with black sounding names and white sounding names. And they sent out like 5,000 resumes to a number of different jobs. They didn't send the same resume to the same place, but they sent them to enough different places that had pretty much the same hiring standards. And, again, 5,000, sort of a big sample, and, you can find the trends. And, this has been done in many, many different studies since that time. And what they wanted to basically figure out, they had the callback number, is would the fake job applicants with the black sounding name be called back as quickly as the fake applicants with the white sounding name? And you probably know where this is going by the way that I'm setting it up. But basically what was found is that the white sounding names were called back much more often, much more quickly than was the case for the stereotypically black sounding names. Very, very interesting set of studies. And, like I said, it's been replicated many times. It's been expanded. They, have done stereotypically male, female names, Arabic names, white names, etc., and, various permutations of this. And showing, that there was discrimination that was playing a role. So quite a fascinating study there. Not, unfortunately, it revealed, a lot of discrimination within the job market. And well, what about AI? AI is doing a lot of resume screening these days. Well, oops, sorry. Um, Not a lot of research on this yet, but one study that's been done looking at some of this found that actually AI is maybe worse. It was found that there was about 6 weeks difference. If black people were called, the black sounding name resume was called back at all, it was a few weeks later, and that's a long time if you're looking for a job. And well, what about AI? I'm not sure exactly which AI they used for this, but you can kind of see what their results were. The resumes with the white sounding names were selected for the hiring 85% of the time, male associated names 52% of the time, resumes with black sounding names selected for 9%. 9% versus 85%. Again, same resumes, different names. In some cases, black men's resumes were never selected. So, you know, kind of dispiriting about, the potential for AI to get around some of that discrimination. You know, you could probably, I'm sure you could program it so it could be less biased, but sure seems like there's a lot of bias there, and I don't know if you would consider that implicit or explicit bias. The bias done by AI may depend on the biases of the programmers. Same thing has been done with a criminal record. And you can see there, same basic resumes, and some people have a criminal record, and some don't. And as you can see, even when there's no criminal record, or I'm sorry, even when there is a criminal record, white people with a criminal record were called back more often than black people who had no criminal record. So again, some pretty big changes there, and this is obviously there's a lot of implications, I think, for criminology, criminal justice, rehabilitation after people leave prison, all these sorts of things. You can see sort of the relevance there. Fantastic book by Keon West kind of compiles a lot of, the recent studies of racism. So in 2007, there was a study. Basically, would doctors offer to help black people with a deadly condition? Would they give them a life-saving treatment? And they had them do the modern racism survey and the implicit association test. Those self-report surveys, everyone was just like, well, I'm not a racist. I have no racial preference. Maybe racist might be too strong racial preference. But their IAT scores showed that, well, it looks like there might be a racial preference. The researchers were able to use those results and predict which doctors were least likely to offer black patients the treatment. Another study that was done in Sweden looking at discrimination in the job market, in this case looking at Muslims in Sweden. They did the CV experiments, sending out all the CVs with just a difference in the name. And this was where I think, they did something which was very interesting, which was they actually contacted the employers and, offered them money if they would take part in this experiment, and they had them take the implicit association test. And they found that these employers tended to have higher levels of their IAT scores predicted higher levels of the anti-Muslim sounding names. So, again, kind of an interesting way to combine both this classic resume survey research with implicit association tests. Another one they did where the implicit association test predicted which hopeful parents were less willing to adopt a black child. And again, there are a lot of other examples of this. So it does seem that the implicit association test points towards something. Again, there are criticisms of it, but it does appear that there is some real usefulness to it. Um, Another one, I think this is particularly interesting and may explain things that happen in people's behavior. So this one looked at a huge, 1 million IAT results. When what they did was they looked at when they were taken, and they wanted to know, if there's some sort of correlation with the circadian rhythms. And what they found was that there was. They found that people more had higher bias scores during times of the day when they had less cognitive control. Another version of this was this. I think this was the implicit association test as well. They had people take it. They found out if people were morning people or if they were night people, and they had the morning people take the implicit association test at night, and the night owls take it in the morning, and again at night, and morning people in the morning. And they found that yes, morning people are more prejudiced at night. Night people are more prejudiced in the morning. So other experiments have been done where they have people, working on like word problems and math equations, and then they have to take the IAT or some similar measure of prejudice and bias and so on, and finding that when people are more cognitively stressed or cognitively taxed, that they are more likely to be biased. And so you can kind of think about the real world and how people who are stressed out may be more likely to behave in biased ways, because it's easier. Stereotypes are easy, and so people will sort of fall back on that. Not necessarily, not consciously. This is sort of done at a very automatic, unconscious level. Your brain is always looking at ways to lower computation. The amount of energy that goes into computations, and if you don't have to think about a person as an individual, which means all sorts of complexity and so on and so forth, but can just kind of categorize them based on their social group. Well, your brain doesn't have to do as much thinking, doesn't have to do as much computations. Again, unfortunately, that does lead to some incorrect assessments, but it kind of points to why people might act the way that they do. Another sort of version looking at automatic processing and bias and so on. So what they did here was they were shown images, they were shown a photograph, and then very quickly a photograph, and then either the gun or the pliers. And essentially, the researchers were measuring the amount of time, or they were basically wanting to see if they actually categorized it right. Is it a weapon or is it a tool? And they found that oftentimes, if they were shown the blackface first, they were more likely to mistake the tool, the pliers, as a gun, as a weapon. So this was something that was found in this research. So the priming there showing a lot. Another sort of interesting experiment that was done where they had them play a video game, and they were told basically you're supposed to shoot the armed people who come into view. Don't shoot the unarmed people, and they found there was a big racial difference in the results. They found that participants were more likely to shoot the unarmed black targets than the unarmed white targets. And importantly, both black and white participants were more likely to accidentally shoot those unarmed black targets. So the responses actually did not vary as much by the race of the participant, which says something about the power of prejudice and bias and the kind of the narratives in society. And this is something I'll get into next time, but kind of along those lines, there's a famous psychologist and writer, theorist named Frantz Fanon. You may have read his work in other classes. Famously wrote a book called Black Skin, White Masks. Another one, The Wretched of the Earth. Major figure in sort of anti-colonial movements and thinking in the 1950s, 1960s, had a huge influence across the world. I thought his quote here is very interesting. When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. If you think, the killing of the black man George Floyd by police in Minneapolis in 2020, he was being choked to death, and he was, his last words were, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And, obviously Frantz Fanon is not necessarily saying that literally, but you do see the sort of very literal, sort of a very literal manifestation of that sort of that feeling and so on. Fanon was from Martinique, an island in the Caribbean. He went and lived in France for a while, and then he went to Algeria, and it was there he did a lot of very interesting work. He was a psychotherapist, and some of his clients were people, Algerians who had been tortured by the French colonialists, and so he would hear them talking about being tortured and trying to, the trauma associated with that. And then sometimes he would have French colonialists as his patients, and they would be coming to talk to him about the trauma that they felt from torturing, people and doing the work of, being a colonial master and so on. So he had a very unique perspective, a very like an insight that that a lot of people don't have and don't really have the opportunity to have, which makes his work, I think, particularly interesting. And just recently, his psychiatric writings have been published, if you're sort of interested in this stuff. So a couple of things about the experiments that I've been talking about, the video game one especially. So he argued that the bias doesn't correlate with the ethnicity of the person who's being monitored. We saw that in the video game experiment, black and white players showing the same bias. But bias does correlate with knowledge of the stereotype. So before playing the video game, players were asked to estimate how dangerous and violent most white Americans consider African Americans to be. And so there was a correlation then between how people performed in the game and how they responded to these measures, which I think is particularly interesting and quite fascinating. Okay, so yeah, I got pretty excited earlier about talking about cognitive biases and mental energy and stereotypes and so on. And yes, what I spoke about earlier, so I'm not going to go over that again. There's something called the Marley hypothesis, and that's this idea that different racial groups make different assessments of the amount of racism in society based on their own knowledge of racial history, and it will be different for black and white Americans. So you can see here that black Americans tend to perceive more systemic racism than white Americans. Obviously, you can sort of hypothesize that, but it's nice to have the actual data there. And why is it called the Marley hypothesis? Well, it comes from the line of the song Buffalo Soldier by Bob Marley. If you know your history, then you will know where you're coming from, and you wouldn't have to ask me, who the heck do I think I am? So an example of this, and this is where I would ask the class if they had ever heard of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia. Usually, when I ask, no one has ever heard of it. Maybe rarely, maybe one or two people will raise their hand. So, this was in the 1980s in Philadelphia. There was a radical black group called MOVE, and they were kind of an offshoot of the Black Panthers. They were, you know, kind of anarchist, and they were vegan and things like that. And the Philadelphia police came to raid the apartment that they were in. And it was only like a couple of apartments, I think. This was not like a compound or something. This was just a some housing in Philadelphia, and you can kind of see there. It's kind of looks like San Francisco. Just houses and apartments close together and so on. And a couple of the members, I think, started shooting at the police, and the police, there's a lot of different ways they could have handled this. For some reason, they decided that it would be best to get a helicopter and literally drop a bomb on the building. And that's what they did. So they dropped the bomb on the building. Again, this is not like this was like a block that was all this MOVE group. I mean, there was a lot of, neighbors who were living there and so on. And it ended up destroying 60 homes and killing 11 of the MOVE members and 5 of their children. I taught at Penn State, and I would ask, people about this, and even in Pennsylvania, where you have a lot of students from Philadelphia. It was really a few students from West Philly. West Philly is where this happened. Historically black part of Philadelphia, and not always, but even a couple of people would raise their hand. So again, kind of a very clear example of the Marley hypothesis. All right, everyone, that is it for the presentation, and we will resume, and I will hopefully be right as rain on Wednesday.